I think there's a lot of different factors along that sort of transition journey, and I think it's going to take quite some time. But my hope is that the transparency, the improved reporting will lead to hopefully a premium for a green metal, incentivizing sustainable production through the energy transition. I think there's a lot of things that have to happen before we get there, though.
Welcome to Smarter Markets, a weekly podcast featuring the icons and entrepreneurs of technology, commodities, and finance, ranting on the inadequacies of our systems and riffing on ideas for how to solve them. Together, we examine the questions: are we facing a crisis of information or a crisis of trust? And will building smarter markets be the antidote? This episode is brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, where trading in centrally cleared, physically deliverable LNG and carbon futures contracts is now underway. Ready for smarter markets?
Welcome to Markets in Transition on Smarter Markets. I'm Dave Greeley, Chief Economist at Abax Technologies. Our guest today is Andrea Aranguren, CEO and President of Minehub Technologies. We'll be discussing making the transition from email and Excel to digital supply chains and what it means for companies and markets. Hello, Andrea. Welcome to Smarter Markets.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for being here to kick off our series on markets in transition. At Minehub, you're working with metals and mining companies to transition to your digital supply chain platform for commodity markets to make their raw material supply chains more efficient, resilient, and sustainable. This is a big transition to make, and a big transition for the commodities markets to make. To help us better understand this transition, I was hoping you could help us start with where companies are now. What is the status quo for how companies and metals and mining manage their supply chains?
Yeah, absolutely. Most companies, whether they're mining companies or smelters or manufacturing companies, will have an ERP system. Most customers we see have SAP or Oracle, Dynamics. We see those a lot. And those systems allow them to manage data internally, but it creates incredible silos for data across the different business units, and it creates complexities the second that data needs to either come into their ecosystem or their internal walls or needs to be shared externally. So that's why companies rely very heavily on Excel and email. Data entry is incredibly manual. Metals is notorious for having a tremendous amount of documents and just a huge volume of data to even manage one contract. And all of that is primarily done pretty much manually, still Excel and email. I often get the question, what's our biggest competitor? And it's definitely Excel and Microsoft Office. But that is changing very much so. So times are changing. There is a recognition of a need to digitize. Companies are starting to make it actually part of their corporate strategy initiatives in order to investigate and move towards leveraging digital tools in order to more effectively manage the way that data is shared and that they manage their supply chains.
So currently, a lot of Microsoft Excel sounds a lot like working in banking. In a lot of places, it's still run on the same thing from a few decades ago. How do you transition companies from that current approach to a digitized supply chain? And what does a digitized supply chain look like?
The transition needs to be gradual. Our customers are billion-dollar companies. They have incredibly complex supply chains. They're sourcing multiple different types of raw material or selling multiple different types of commodities. And so this isn't switch of, you're switching a light switch and everything's just going to change overnight. Of course, this needs to be a gradual change. And so we typically suggest and utilize a phased implementation approach where we start on one scope, whether it's one geography or one type of metal, one set of customers or one set of suppliers. And we'll start with digitizing that portion of the supply chain and then move on from there. And that has been really effective in our ability to help manage that transition because it really is a slow transition given the complexity in many of these supply chains. In terms of your second question, what does a digitized supply chain look like? I don't think that we've fully seen that yet, but in theory, would be a completely integrated, wholly digital network where every node in the supply chain, whether it's a buyer, a seller, a logistics provider, a bank, an insurer, are all seamlessly integrated into a secure digital platform. And that allows all of those different nodes and stakeholders to manage what they need to do and to share data effectively in a secure manner. And that will start with everything like pre-trade. So any transactions on an exchange like ABAX, or whether it's requests for quotes, which we see very often in the space, managed completely digitally, and then transition to sort of post-trade execution for the fulfillment of those contracts. And then, of course, integrated with the financing of those transactions and the insurance of them.
I find it really interesting the way you start with, let's start in one aspect of the business, one supply chain, because these companies have so many. I'm curious, is there a typical oh wow moment that can happen when this is going well, where companies realize the benefit when they start working in one silo of taking the effort to move to a digital supply chain?
Yes, there's the first oh wow moment that we see is, this is not as hard as I thought it was going to be. I think when people I need to get all of my suppliers sharing data to this one platform for all of my business. We've been doing things the same way for hundreds of years, and that's going to be hard. And we actually have had a lot of success doing that. And we've come a really long way. From 4 years ago, it was a heavy lift to start an implementation. Now, most customers within 30 days, everything's up and running. And that is very shocking to most of our customers. That's the first oh wow moment. And then I think the oh wow moment, it's when you're doing things one way for so long, it's hard to imagine what it would be like to do something completely different, completely digital. Like, what does that even feel like to walk in the morning and open a portal and everything is up to date and reconciled for you, and all the time that opens up and all the insight that opens up. And so something that's really key about our phased implementation approach is that we will pick either one whole facility or one entire type of material, because when you get 100% of one piece of the business, that's when you can really see those efficiencies and start running reporting and really leverage the impact of all of that digital data in one place.
Do you find that first adopter that you go to in a company ends up being the cheerleader, and is the second one much easier to get?
Yes. Oh, yes, very much so. We were incredibly lucky with our lighthouse customer because they were willing to take a leap of faith in us, and that made it so much easier for every other customer that came behind them, for sure.
And you mentioned part of why, I think people stay on Excel or stay with pen and paper is because it's not just transforming your own company's processes, but then all the suppliers you're working with and the folks you're selling forward to. How do you get the buy-in across the company lines for something like this?
We always need a champion, right? Because this is innovative and different and not necessarily required yet, right? So we could talk about some of the forces driving digitization and a need for digital platforms, one of those being regulations. So I think that will change soon. But can you continue to operate in Excel and email today? You could. Is it optimal and is it going to be sustainable in the long run? No. And so therefore, it's about somebody believing in the need for change and being that internal advocate for us, but also for all of their counterparties. Because as you mentioned, the change management process will inevitably affect our customers' customers or our customer suppliers, and will require at least some slight modification in the way that information is shared in order to drive those efficiencies. So it is not just about changing your own company, but it will impact the rest of your supply chain.
And how do you get the company's suppliers to get on board with it? Is it finding a champion there as well?
No. So very early on, we realized we're a small startup. How are we going to convince all these large mining companies or manufacturers to change the way they do things? And the reality is we're not, right? So who are they actually going to listen to is their customers. So we very purposefully went after the largest companies in the market because they are the ones that will drive adoption for us. So our first customer was a large manufacturing customer that required the use of the platform. If you wanted to sell to them, you had to use the platform. And there were some suppliers that, were sort of resisting, and they threatened to not do business with them anymore. And so that level of commitment made this possible in a lot of ways. And that early adoption was really critical for our commercial success.
We've brought up a few times Microsoft and Excel and email as kind of the tools of the status quo. I think when people hear the phrase digitized supply chains, their minds often go to blockchain and tokenization. And I'm curious, there's a lot of technology in between there. What technology is required for what you do?
I do not think blockchain or tokens are required, I'll say. We do use blockchain for one of our premium applications called the Assay Exchange, because that was a customer requirement from a very large customer. Blockchain is not required. What's required is security. So our platform is AWS cloud hosted, but we invest a tremendous amount of time and effort in ensuring that the platform upholds the highest market standards as it relates to security. Data privacy is absolutely critical. So we would have zero engagement for the market if we didn't ensure that data wasn't just safe, but private. And then the other thing that's key from a technology perspective is interoperability, open APIs to help facilitate data between systems, because inevitably we'll have to share data between a wide variety of systems. So definitely don't require blockchain for, interoperability, APIs, and security.
All well-known things probably used in other parts of the organization in some capacity, I guess.
That's right.
You brought up earlier when the first adopters go in and they can kind of look to their screen in the morning and see all the information about what's happening in their supply chain. It made me wonder, having that different view into what's flowing through your supply chain after moving to a digital supply chain platform like yours, how does that change how companies think about and manage their physical supply chains?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Our customers are obviously buyers and sellers in the market, but I'll just, for argument's sake, choose an example from a buyer perspective. But in the absence of tools like the Minehub platform, buyers, they don't have great visibility into their incoming supply chain. So they don't know exactly when shipments are going to arrive. They don't have great tools to manage their inventory. And so they often end up holding excess inventory on site or overbuying metal in order to prevent plant shutdowns, because plant shutdowns are very costly for them. And so we've seen our manufacturing customers be able to reduce inventory on hand pretty dramatically. One of our customers actually reduced from 15 days inventory on hand to 5, while also preventing 5 plant shutdowns. So those are the benefits that we see from the improved visibility that the digital platform provides, as well as the inventory management tools that are possible.
Those seem like really big changes. I mean, cutting the inventories that you have to have on hand down to a third of what you had before, I think, and not having stockouts and other supply chain disruptions, which we all became familiar with during the pandemic. When you look with those types of efficiency gains, how impressive is that to the customers you work with? How transformative is it for them?
It's incredibly transformative. And that's actually what helps our platform to be quite sticky, is they really come to rely on it and see that value increases over time as the implementation expands and the volume of data that's digitized grows, enhances all of the value, whether it's around visibility or inventory or reporting. There's huge operational efficiencies and time savings that companies experience that they come to rely on. We have one customer that they receive all of the trucks that arrive at their plants through our platform. And they did a study to see how long it took them to manage receiving before and after. And they saved 12 days every 2 months from using our platform. And so that's just one small example, but it becomes transformative and companies come to rely on it more and more.
I find that really intriguing. Like, what does receiving a truck using your platform look like? Is there somebody out there with an iPad as the truck rolls into the bay?
So sometimes there's iPads or sometimes there's a desktop at the gate when the truck shows up. So we pre-create the shipments because we'll know they're in transit. We're tracking them so they can better manage capacity at the plant when it's going to arrive. The majority of the information is pre-filled out. And then the truck shows up. They just basically weigh it on the way out and they put the gross and the net weight and mark it as received. So it really reduces the amount of information and data they need to manually input and streamlines the whole process.
Makes it sound like the change is worth it. And I wanted to ask you, because change is hard, particularly in large companies that for many of your clients. At Minehub, you work with some of the largest companies in metals and mining. And I was curious, what's driving these companies to make such a big change in how they manage their supply chains? You mentioned regulations that are coming. And I also was curious, how large a part is the increasing desire of stakeholders to understand the origin of the commodities in the supply chain playing? For example, over recent years, people not wanting material that came from Russia, or certain ESG considerations of wanting to understand carbon footprints of the commodities in their supply chain.
Regulations is huge, whether it's Inflation Reduction Act or sanctions. Russian sanctions on metal was a big one, or ESG reporting, the regulations that we see out of Europe, increasing requirements around any of our customers that are selling into Europe. That is a huge reason for change. And we see that having a huge impact across the board. I would say it started a bit earlier post-COVID. We saw a huge shift in mindset and a huge increase in willingness and recognition of a need to digitize, not just to drive efficiencies, but in order to mitigate all the risks that they were seeing in the market. So continued supply chain disruptions in freight markets. We see labor shortages where it's getting harder to actually hire and retain workers to do all this manual Excel work. It just felt like COVID really aggravated a lot of that, and companies realized they needed to change. And then all of the regulations are just adding to that, really increasing a momentum and a recognition for change. The need to understand origin is really critical. We're very focused on copper and aluminum. The focus there is really on brand and smelter, because from that you can see origin. Of course, we track all of the shipments, but also from an emissions perspective, it's incredibly important for our customers to be able to track that and provide proof around data and report to maintain their operations. So I would say a lot of different forces sort of compiling it together, driving this need for digitization.
It's interesting because some of the things that you mentioned, it almost feels like from a retail perspective, many of us have gotten used to having a lot of these tools available. You order something from Amazon, you can see how far away from your house the truck is. And it's interesting. Do you find like what's happening in the commodities industry needs to move to, kind of some of the best practices that maybe we're used to seeing on the retail side?
Yeah, it's funny you said that, because when we co-founded Weybridge back in 2019 and we had our first investor meeting and we were doing our pitch, we said, how could it be that I'm buying a pair of shoes on Amazon and I know exactly where they are and when they're going to arrive and the payment is seamless and, whatever type of shoe, and you find a million different options and everything is just completely seamless, and you're buying $500,000 worth of copper and you have no idea where it is. You have no idea when it's going to arrive. The documents are God knows where. And so how can this actually be reality? So it's funny you said that, because that was actually one of the sort of the genesis of Weybridge, was this like recognition of we take advantage of all these tools in our personal lives, yet this hugely important physical commodities market can't leverage any of these tools. So yes, I do think that is sort of the vision for us, and the hope is this transition to this sort of seamless digital experience, very similar to what we experience when we buy Domino's pizza or something on Amazon.
But much larger scale.
Many more dollars.
And it's interesting, when you bring up the complexity, and you mentioned earlier that Minehub is a smaller company. And when thinking about how change is driven in these companies and these markets, I find it really interesting that it's increasingly smaller companies like Minehub that are developing the new technology and driving the innovation that then gets brought on board by large companies. Kind of reminds me of the old skunkworks approach to driving innovation in a large company. But of course, without the funding that a large company would provide to a skunkworks division. What do you see as the benefits and challenges of this approach of like driving change from a small company?
Absolutely. The biggest benefit is flexibility. Our customers' needs are constantly changing. The market needs are changing as regulations evolve and different dynamics emerge. So our ability to be incredibly nimble and flexible to adjust and shift direction has been really critical. 4 years ago, if you looked at our product roadmap, it was pretty dramatically different to what our product looks now. And I think that ability to really listen to the customer's needs and adapt has been critical here. I think probably the biggest drawback is related to what we were talking about before, which is really around adoption. So, if you're a large multi-billion-dollar company with an incredibly complex global supply chain, are you going to actually put all of your critical confidential data and transition your company to relying on a startup, questions around financial stability or just ability to support a company at that scale? And so we've been, fortunate to have a very strong balance sheet that has certainly helped us through this. But it's also related to what I mentioned before, which is our strategy has been to really partner with our customers to help drive adoption, and recognize that as a small company, that is actually one of the drawbacks. And we should just acknowledge that and partner with customers that will help us to really push their counterparties, their logistics providers, their warehouses to change their processes. Because as a small company, we may not have the sort of power or the market position to do that.
I wanted to ask you a question about the data security piece, because sometimes the reason companies give for staying with the way they do it is you don't want your information getting out there. How important of an obstacle is the data security piece to getting companies to change over their workflow to a more digital platform? And how do you try to address it?
I would say that's probably the number one most important piece. As I said, we invest a huge amount of time and effort in maintaining data security and upholding the highest standards and proving that we do so. So we're audited, we have a SOC 2 certification, we have regular pen tests, but that proves to be not enough for really large customers. Many of our large customers have hired external consultants. They've performed ethical hacking exercises on our platform. I mean, I've filled out more 1,000-line security questionnaires than I'd like to admit. Even free users of the platform vet the platform very, very intensely in a willingness to engage and share data. And so this has been the number one issue, and not just security around data, but ownership of data, privacy of data. And so it's something that is at the forefront of everything that we do. It's top of mind in every single conversation, and we're constantly managing that with customers. And we spend a lot of time ensuring that we're not going to have any issues supporting customers as they build that confidence through their own processes.
And what do you think is the thing that gives customers the most confidence?
The thing that gives the customers most confidence is seeing their peers in the market managing their businesses on our platform. That is really important. We go to customers and say, Codelco is managing 100% of the refined copper sales via our platform. That gives a huge amount of credibility and comfort to the market.
And you had brought up something earlier that I wanted to go back to, which is you mentioned how your roadmap has adjusts and you have the benefit of flexibility as client needs change. And I wanted to ask you, because of course there's the old thing of Henry Ford saying if he had asked the clients what they needed, they'd say a faster horse. And so how do you, in this kind of transformational, transitional moment, how do you get a good feel for what the client's needs are and how you can help them?
By doing broad discovery. So we can't just have a conversation with one customer. So critical to what we do is that this is not a custom-built platform that meets one customer's needs. But the issue is all the customers' needs are different. So what is really sort of the market need? What is the problem we're trying to solve? And how do we do that in a way that's more efficient for all, taking into account all the different sort of unique considerations of the customer? So we invest a lot of time in discovery, as we call it, just having discussions with customers, whether they're paying customers, they're free users, they're potential customers, they're partners, just really ensuring that what we're building is not just based on one customer's perspective, but that it will meet the market need.
You can say if you don't want to divulge any of the IP here, but when you've kind of done some of this broad discovery, is there something you've learned about how the market works or what the market needs that was surprising to you?
I was very surprised at how different every company's processes are from one company to the other. This is a really small, and maybe it's a bit of a dumb example, but I was in logistics for many years. And of course, fundamental to everything we do is bills of lading. And so when we were capturing shipment data on the system, of course, you were going to use a bill of lading number as a shipment identifier. And I was shocked at how many warehouses and customers do not have bill of lading in their system and use some other form of shipment ID, which creates a lot of complexity for matching shipments that leave one place and arrive at the other place when they have different identifiers. So it's sort of like a small thing, but it's how is everybody not just using the same number to identify a shipment? That was very surprising to me.
That's fascinating. I mean, there's so much that goes into that, right? Of just how do you identify these various pieces of information? How do you let them take on a life of their own? And all the inherited processes. I could imagine some companies, they started at 100 and went from there.
Exactly. One warehouse we deal with, they generate a bill of lading on a system that cannot digitally PDF it. They can only print it. So they need to print everything and then scan it before they can email it to everybody. And their system reached the max of characters for the bills of lading. So now they handwrite -A, -B, handwritten on what they print before they scan it. I mean, I'm not even making this up.
I believe it's what you do, right? You make do, you kind of take the next increment, and then 10 years down the road, you're kind of wondering, how did we get here?
Exactly.
And I wanted to ask you, change is often worth it, but, change is often hard. And there's a lot of benefits that you've discussed about using digital supply chain platforms. And I think there's a lot of benefit to using the same digital supply chain platform as the other companies in your network. I imagine the implication of that is that once you get companies to start changing over, there's a pretty strong network effect. There's a winner-take-all aspect that everybody wants to use the same thing, not uncommon in technology. I was curious if you agree with that, and if so, what's your strategy to be the digital supply chain solution of choice?
I 100% agree, of course. There is an incredibly strong network effect. From our perspective, it's not just from an efficiency and a value perspective, but it's also from that credibility perspective we were talking about. Our platform can handle is what we say material agnostic. So we could support any physical commodity on the platform, but we've been very deliberate to focus on copper and aluminum initially, precisely because of our desire to optimize that network effect. And I'll just give you an example. As part of our first customer implementation, we onboarded about 25 different suppliers. So 25 new companies that had to get comfortable with a new way of operating, with sharing data, creating automated reports for their customer. The second customer, we signed the second customer implementation, we only needed to onboard one new supplier. There was so much overlap. And that's just a supplier perspective. From a carrier, from a logistics partner perspective, the first time we onboarded like 35 different trucking companies. The second time, it was like 3 new companies. So it really does speed up every implementation. It allows us to take advantage of the overlap in the market from a buyer and a seller and a logistics perspective. So for us, it's actually been incredibly core to our strategy and allows us to be lean and incredibly scalable in every new implementation that we do.
Well, thank you for coming in and sharing with us how you're transforming these supply chains. To me, it's fascinating. But I was hoping before we go, taking a step back, if you imagine a future where metals and mining companies have made the transition to email and Excel to more digital supply chains, how do you see that transition changing the nature of the data and information available to companies and to markets, and changing the nature of how commodities are traded?
It's quite a question. I think inevitably, of course, there'll be more transparency, more access to data, more proof around that data and confidence in the data that's being shared, whether it's ESG related or otherwise. I think there's a lot of different factors along that sort of transition journey, and I think it's going to take quite some time. But my hope is that the transparency, the improved reporting will lead to hopefully a premium for a green metal, incentivizing sustainable production through the energy transition. I think there's a lot of things that have to happen before we get there, though.
Thanks again to Andrea Aranguren, CEO and President of Minehub Technologies. We hope you enjoyed the episode. We'll be back next week with another episode of Markets in Transition. We hope you'll join us.
This episode was brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, where trading in centrally cleared, physically deliverable LNG and carbon futures contracts is now underway. Ready for smarter markets? Contact us at onboarding@abax.exchange. That concludes this week's episode of Smarter Markets by Abax. For episode transcripts and additional episode information, including research, editorial, and video content, please visit smartermarkets.media. Please help more people discover the podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Smarter Markets is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Smarter Markets should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Smarter Markets are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or producer. Smarter Markets, its hosts, guests, employees, and producer, Abax Technologies, shall not be held liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on informational viewpoints presented on Smarter Markets. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.